Happy Halloween, everyone, and welcome to the final installment of Jack-O-Ween, Flesh and Soul. I was trying to think of what movie would perfectly encapsulate the spooky season, and would also combine what I've talked about the horrors of the flesh and the horrors of the soul, with still the vibes of Halloween. And it just so happens to have two of the greatest horror inspirations of all time, Mario Bava and Boris Karloff. So for the final review, we're going to talk about Black Sabbath. Enter into a horror journey of 3 stories involving monsters, the dead, and all sorts of other unnerving things, hosted by the macabre monster master himself, Boris Karloff. This is a movie that somehow lives in the ether of both underrated and beloved. It's either loved or not known about, seen as somewhat campy, or seen as pretty well above its time. As you could probably tell from my VHS movie reviews, I am a fan of anthology horror that is done correctly. This is it done perfectly, encapsulating the overarching theme, that being the supernatural, dealing with subjects like ghosts and death, possessions, and monsters. Who to trust, who not to trust. Can you even trust your own senses? All with an overwhelming vibe that the great Boris Karloff brings to the silver screen. The movie is split into 3 separate distinct segments: the telephone, the word-a-lock, and the drop of water. All 3 segments have an overlying theme of things beyond the norm, and also a rural setting of time that feels old-timey and somewhat dated at the same time. It's very hard to talk about this movie without giving anything away, because, of course, if I did, then it kind of deflates the feeling of watching it with someone new. Mario Bava was a pioneer in his time, developing what would later be known as shock horror or jump scares. There weren't really that many in his time, but a lot of the inspiration came from his style. Using the camera's advantage to scope out the area and let us delve with the characters without ever giving anything away to us exclusively, and letting us digest it just along with the main characters. The narration by Boris Karloff, and him starring in one of the segments, is actually really interesting, because you see the dynamic of a man who long past his prime telling stories as if he's an old grandpa, telling you a story at a campfire, or telling you a story that is an old folk tale from long ago, but you feel somewhat warm and yet also kind of creeped out by his narration and presence. He did the same thing with the series Thriller, which many of you have probably never heard of, but I highly recommend checking out, as it is a fun anthology horror series in the same vein as Twilight Zone or Night Gallery, but not quite as good as those, but it has a lot of fun elements to it too. One of the other things that Mario Bava constantly would do is that he would redub his movies, or he would hire actors who were both fluent in English and Italian, have them redo their entire movies or entire scenes. That way he could corner the market on both the Italian and non-Italian markets. This is one of those examples. And one of the downsides to that is that this movie is released in both Italian with subtitles and in English. And most people can't really seem to appreciate the English one, as the Italian one has become the default one. And there's nothing wrong with the Italian cut. However, I feel that since the movie was originally dubbed in English, and it did have Boris Karloff, it's weird to see his mouth moving and hear an Italian guy talking. It just doesn't feel right. Whereas in the original dub, you obviously see Karloff. So it's kind of a mixed bag if you prefer the subtitle version or if you prefer the regular version. In fact, the subtitle version is the one that's on Shudder, which is kind of a bummer because you want to see the original, not the subtitled version. But luckily, Kino bought the redistribution rights of Black Sabbath in all of its original glory and put it on Blu-ray. So, if you want, you could actually own both versions, which I do. However, I personally prefer the dubbed version, as it is the original version that most people saw in the 60s. And yes, elements of the movie and the very name itself did inspire one of the greatest bands of all time, aptly named Black Sabbath. So to say this movie doesn't have a long legacy is an understatement, and yet it's somehow still underappreciated by so many people. So, take it as a little bit of homework. Why not enjoy Black Sabbath this Halloween season? Get a couple friends over, and maybe have a good spooky time. Well, that concludes this year's Jack-O-Ween. I want to give one final thank you to Happy the Knife and all of the contributors over on his channel with the Helldünkel series, and for everyone who just subscribed to my channel. Thank you so much. I hope that every one of you have a great Halloween season and you enjoy it in your own fun way. My next review might not be quite what you expect, but I will get back to form pretty soon. Till then, take care and I'll see you next time.